on basically about the relationship between higher education, what we're calling emerging credentials. Have gotten a few questions about what do we mean by emerging credentials. I, at one point, was using the term non-academic. And Mother, do you have the clicker? Or is there a... Wait, over there. Cool, cool. There we go. Perfect. What do we mean? What we mean... I struggled a little bit with this. How are we framing this? But the panel was conceived with this idea that higher education as an issue of credentials, both degree credentials and non-degree credentials, may be under threat, maybe under competitive pressure from different sources. And I can say a little bit about a few of the developments that kind of motivated this again. One was the Coursera-Udemy merger, which was announced in December. This, in my opinion, was actually a really important event for our field and one that kind of slid under the radar for a lot of people. The merger, one reason for the merger might have simply been that these companies were not as large as we might have thought they might at one time become, given all of the attention that's been given over the years to massive online courses, given this kind of vision that motivated the early online course movement, thinking back to when I was an undergraduate in 2007, 2008, when these courses were coming online and universities were forming these partnerships. And we really thought of this as a way that we were going to scale and democratize higher education worldwide. Certainly these platforms have had an impact, but they were not particularly profitable. There was also signs over the past year that the relationship between Coursera and some of the higher education institutions on the platform had been getting a little bit less cozy. There's been increases in the fees that have been charged to the partner universities. There was a platform fee that was particularly controversial in the case of Coursera. And also a lot more corporations and employers that were publishing their own courses directly on the platform. But then the merger with Udemy came along, and Udemy, for those of you who don't know, is a platform that offers a lot of skill-based courses. A lot of these courses are offered by people who are really good instructors, really effective. If you're people like Khan Academy, these YouTube channels that are really, and people who create content creators who are really good at teaching one to do algebra or to practice technical skills. Really good teaching, but not university-based by and large. So this was kind of an interesting development. And I was like, is this a part of a broader social trend that we're seeing where higher education is losing some of that, maybe not a monopoly, but losing some of its position as a kind of a privileged and sought-after source of skills for lifelong learners. The other phenomenon that really shaped my thinking in developing this panel idea was the proliferation of AI-powered tools for skill development, and also the phenomenon of people who are just using AI bots, who are using just the general consumer versions of ChatGPT, Gemini, and Claude to really build their own personalized tutoring and to learn skills directly that might be of interest to them. There was actually an AI-powered skill development app called Mosaic AI that reached out to my research team at GW last November. And they had a really provocative view that AI could and should be used to just teach anybody anything. And they made a little allusion to, well, maybe someday when we really grow, we might bring in some humans to do some review of the AI's output. But for now, it's just going to be an AI, our app is just going to be an AI wrapper, basically. And this idea that suddenly now we can really truly learn anything on demand, is that further eroding some of the reasons that people might be coming to campus, some of the reasons that people might be coming back to universities for lifelong learning. And the other thing that happened was a panel that I was at a creator economy conference where some professional content creators were talking about how they thought that they were better than professors in higher education, that they were able to be more effectively teach skills to their followers. And one of them was talking about how he charges $15,000 a year for a custom mentoring program where people can learn basically stuff like house flipping was for one of these creators. But it turned out that there are creators all across this creator economy right now, people who have large followings on Instagram and TikTok and different places, who are making a really good living, in often cases actually building whole businesses around providing direct mentoring and instruction directly to their fans, to their followers, and offering these skills that have a really clear vocational focus. It's really concentrated right now in, I'd say, in entrepreneurship. But even there, one of the creators on this conference panel was talking about how she herself was interested in potentially pursuing accreditation for a non-degree credential, potentially an industry certification program that she wanted to launch, and offer to her followers. So I think so that was also got my attention and said, there's something here that maybe we should talk about. Is higher education losing ground? Again, I'm sorry, I apologize. Roy can give me a mean face, for using such a vague terminology here. But, it's emerging credentials. Again, this idea that maybe there's some competitive pressure that we should look at. Is higher education losing some of its authority? So, with all this said, I thought I would bring together a couple of individuals who are welcome to join us on stage. Larry Schall. And Larry Schall is president of the New England Commission on Higher Education. Hey, thanks. He was first vice president of Swarthmore College and then president of Oglethorpe University in Atlanta. And he's been president of the New England Commission since 2020. And under his leadership, they have been transforming accreditation from a prescriptive compliance exercise into a more innovative partnership-based approach to quality assurance. They accredit more than 200 very diverse institutions spanning 2- and 4-year private and public, and ranging from 20 students to over 100,000. So Larry brings to this conversation a really unique vantage point of being a regional accreditor, and I think that's really grappling firsthand with the rise of all these different types of credentials in the broader ecosystem. We also have Kelvin Bentley. Kelvin is no stranger to the NCRN. I think he actually, we did a tally of, I think he's your first-time speaker, and we did a tally actually of who has been most engaged in our webinars and who has the best webinar attendance record, and you were right at the top, Kelvin. So, actually my round of applause for that webinar attendance. Yes. So Kelvin worked previously as a program manager. He was the inaugural program manager for Texas Credentials for the Future within the University of Texas system. That was an initiative that went for several years that did a lot of really groundbreaking work in trying to bring microcredentials, including from the Coursera platform, into the University of Texas system and make those credentials available to learners across the whole UT system, across multiple campuses from San Antonio to Austin to the whole thing, right? Throughout the whole state. So it's a really was a really impactful program there. He was managing the Beyond Completion Challenge grant from Strata, which supported the system's microcredentialing efforts actually across 14 universities and health science institutions. There, as I mentioned, there was a partnership with Coursera and also with IBM and Google. And then now today, he's also an inaugural project director for NASH's National Association of Higher Education Systems Community of Practice on Microcredentials. And he'll tell us, I think, a little bit about your work there at NASH in just a moment. So I'm hoping this session will take on a little bit of a life of its own. We'll take a lot of questions from the audience, but I'll start off by inviting both of our speakers. I think maybe we'll start with you, Kelvin, and then go to Larry, just to react to this premise I proposed. Is higher education, are we losing ground to emerging credentials from providers outside of traditional higher education? And also maybe you can address this, and as you address this, maybe speak a little bit about your organization, your current work in this space.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and again, thank you for this conference, by the way. I almost feel like this conference, like the power of this conference in terms of the topics that we're covering, I don't know. I feel like in some ways this group is like underestimated in terms of its ability to influence bigger conversations that maybe we're not having at other conferences that we go to. So just wanted to mention that. I don't think higher ed is necessarily losing ground. I think the ongoing challenge is that, and this was mentioned in our previous panel with Roy and Jeff, I think we're we're losing the narrative, right? I think it's still difficult for higher ed to define its value, because I think to some extent, again, we know what we offer, right, at a macro level, right? We offer degrees, we offer certificates, right? We offer social networks and those types of things. But I think, again, underneath, we still, at the course levels, for example, we still don't really do a great job of really kind of defining in a language, especially like in the world of work, that's more understandable. Like we talk about like learning objectives, but students don't really remember the learning objectives of every course, right? And then of course we use grades and those types of things, which again, employers don't value the grades, right? So it's like, again, we have this problem where we don't really, again, we have the Tower of Babel problem. But one thing that I'll actually bring up, I think because higher ed in some ways, especially those that are not like, especially schools that don't really have strong brand recognition, like for example, even within the University of Texas system, right? Our flagship, or the flagship in Texas, right, is UT Austin, right? Everyone knows that. But if I were to say, yeah, Permian Basin or UT Rio Grande Valley, you'd be like, what did you learn there? And if you were an employer, you might actually devalue the fact that you actually got a degree from there versus UT Austin or from another school. But I would say in this, I don't know if it's necessarily a race between the value of higher ed credentials versus non-degree credentials. We know that students are coming, even high school students are coming with, let's say, a Google cert in data analytics or cybersecurity or even AI. Google just released a new AI professional cert. But I think one of the things that higher ed could do a much better job of is really doing what was mentioned in the previous panel by Jeff and Roy, which is doing more, like collecting better data about those learners, right? So, for example, within the University of Texas system, I think they're probably closer to almost 30,000 learners, right, who have at least enrolled in one or more cert from providers like Google, Meta, IBM. But even in the system, when I was there wasn't always an easy way to track all of that data. And I would say, and maybe by a show of hands, and then I'm going to pass the mic to Larry, because I can talk all day on this. By a show of hands, like how many of your institutions are already using like Coursera or Udemy? Like, do you know if your school is doing that? And if so, to what extent are your schools actually collecting data about the learners enrolled, right? Which is one thing, and that's pretty easy to do, but I don't think a lot of schools do it. IR officers are not really collecting that data. It's not tied to Title IV funds. No one is really kicking down the doors and saying, where's my Coursera data, right? Like no one's asking for it, so no one will collect it. And then secondly, the other problem, which is the longitudinal piece, right? So you can enroll, you can complete, but guess what? To what extent is there an impact on the learner in the world of work? And that data is also severely lacking, regardless of whether the learning came from from providers on the Coursera platform or LinkedIn Learning or other platforms. And so I think that's something that we need to be paying even more attention to than whether or not higher ed is losing out to non-credentials, because I don't think it will, but it needs to get ahead of its own messaging about what it offers. But what it offers now is inclusive of the microcredential pathways that are offered by providers like Coursera and others.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Kyle, for putting this together. Just before I sort of get to the question, this whole issue of the sort of narrative of higher education is a fascinating one to me, because while it may be that we struggle to sort of tell our story, I think it's just important to understand that there's been a very intentional effort and a political effort to undermine our story. And so, I think the issue may be less about our ability to tell our story than it is sort of very intentional political strategy to demean and to undermine and to attack higher education, which, we see in spades right now. But so pleased to be here for sure. So, I think it's a provocative title, but I would sort of agree with Kelvin that I don't think losing ground is is quite the right phrase. We accredit several hundred colleges and universities across the United States. We are none of the formerly regionals are regional anymore. But we also accredit many institutions, freestanding institutions globally. And I think if you look at the portfolio of those institutions, some more than others, I would say that higher education in some ways is at the sort of forefront of the credential movement. We've seen that, with our community colleges for, decades and decades. We're just having a conversation at over breakfast this morning. Northeastern's one of the schools that we accredit, and I think they're now offering over 150. I think they call them badges. But even sort of prestigious schools like Northeastern are operating in this world now. So the New England Commission, we date back to 1885, or we were the first, very sort of traditional. What we've done for our entire history is accredit degree-granting institutions and the credit-bearing side of degree-granting institutions. About 3 years ago, with the support of the Lumina Foundation seems to be supporting pretty much everyone. We began to explore the idea, was there a role for a traditional accrediting agency to sort of dip its toes into the world of quality assurance on the non-credit side? And it was a really interesting conversation in front of our commission, because our commission is made up of presidents, chief financial officers, provosts, faculty from traditional higher education institutions. And so you would have sort of imagined that those people, if we said, what about our starting a second line of business where we're doing quality assurance for non-credit providers, some of that for traditional providers of higher education, but also for, nonprofits and for-profits that, have never been in the, don't offer degrees. So again, you would have sort of imagined if that group of people sort of saw this as a threat, they'd say, no, we're not going there. Why would we sort of lend our credibility to this world? And in fact, that was not the conversation. So they authorized us to, we spent a year trying to figure out what would be the markers of quality for providers of non-credit credentials. We convened a working group to do that, came up with 17 markers of quality. Some of them look, sort of bear some resemblance to markers of quality for on the credit-bearing side, but in fact turned out quite differently. We have one of those markers has to do with agility. You would never sort of imagine that agility was a marker of quality for a credit-providing institution. Much more sort of emphasis on assessment, on return on investment and things like that. So at the end of the year, we came up with these 17 markers. We spent the second year in a pilot testing that to 8 providers, some, again, traditional, some less traditional. And then about a year ago, the commission authorized us to begin this project officially. We use the verb recognized as opposed to accredited, because accredited has Title IV implications. So we've now commission recognized last fall 8 providers. We have 14 providers in the Spring 26 cohort that have submitted reports to us. We have the process is similar. the provider submits a report to those 17 markers. We then send teams out, sometimes face-to-face, sometimes virtual, to do a sort of an assessment and verification of that. And those will then come to the commission. Those 14 will come to the commission in the fall. And we're now working on a fall 2026 cohort. So there's been a lot more interest than we sort of imagined early on. We are about to sort of issue what we're sort of calling a playbook on each of those 17 markers. So that playbook will talk about things like what does the marker mean, why does it matter, what are examples of evidence to support that marker, what do strong practices look like. And again, those 17 markers, about 10 of them focus on the student learning experience. That includes, again, things like assessment, pipeline to credit. And then there's a half a dozen that focus on organizational commitment, financial capacity, governance, technological capacity, et cetera. So it's got mentioned before that the Higher Learning Commission has sort of got another sort of version of this that they announced about the same time we did. So we're excited to sort of be, partners of them into this world. There are millions of credentials being offered. It's not our expectation that we will be the one doing it, but I think we'll be an important player in this business.
So we'll take some questions from the audience, but I do have a couple of Slidos. I'm a big fan of Slido. I think it's kind of nice to get some wider levels of engagement. So I'm going to start here, and we set this up as a multiple choice, and it might be an infuriating multiple choice, because many of you might say the answer is both or neither, but it's kind of a pulse check, just to kind of see which one of these perspectives resonates more with you. Do you see this as more complementary? Do you see more opportunities for complements between higher education and non-higher education training providers, or do we see more competition? Okay. This room is looking very, very much on the complements side, which makes sense. Kelvin, that's probably where you are, right?
Yeah. So, and I apologize. I forgot to mention, the National Association of Higher Ed Systems, which used to be called the National Association of System Heads. So in a weird way, we changed the name but kept the acronym, which confuses some people. But within NASH, and I started working with NASH more on a part-time basis about back in the fall of 2024. So I was still with the University of Texas system, but we were trying to create a community of practice. We received some initial funding from the corporate side of Google. So Google and NASH formed an initial relationship to have like 11 community college and university systems that are NASH members actually figure out a way to share more information about how do you actually integrate industry credentials into curriculum and also co-curricularly, right? Because obviously, because of academic freedom and other things, not every faculty member is going to want to integrate a Google cert or a Meta cert or a cert from other providers in their course. But we have been trying to also work with systems to do it co-curricularly where it makes sense. And so I started that work, again, back in fall of 2024. And then now, as a full-time member of NASH, we have some philanthropic funding from the google.org side of things. And so now we've grown the community of practice from 11 systems to 17. And for those of you who are not familiar with NASH, I think NASH is really doing some cool things. Like NASH and SHIO, I think, are brothers and sisters, right? Like they're both trying to, at a systemic level, impact change, right? SHIO is more focused on the policy side of things, much more so than NASH. NASH has more of the ear of again, leaders of large systems, right? Like SUNY and CUNY, California Community College System. Those are actually some of the larger systems that are a part of our community of practice today. And it's interesting because, some systems are not very top down, so they're not telling people, yes, this is the framework you need to use, or you need to make sure you use only, if there's 1 million of these industry certs, only use these 5, right? There's at the system level, we are trying to work with systems to help them figure out how to do this work. And and as Holly mentioned earlier, it's everything. Kemi Jonah, for example, at the University of Virginia, even talks about this, flooding the zone, right? It's really lots of different things that I think we have to make learners more aware of in terms of not just the credentials, but also something that I'm really interested in based on Kemi's work, which is really how do you actually, we talk about stacking a lot, which I have mixed feelings about, because I don't know if a faculty member, I'm not sure if every school is going to give credit to, let's say, a Google cert, even if ACE, and how many people here are from ACE? I think there's a couple. ACE has certain recommendations about credit, but we also know that sometimes stackability is in a framework, right, to say it's high quality, but guess what? Not every school is going to allow for stackability because of certain biases about where that credit came from. It's oh, well, Google is not us, so obviously we can't accept. Right? It's how short-sighted of us to always think that we offer the best content. I'm getting away from what I wanted to say, but now with our community of practice in NASH, we are up to 17 systems, and right now we have almost 23,000 learners across those systems that are enrolled, in a Google specialization or cert. And with the AI cert, it'll be interesting just to see how many more people, it's news, but it'll be interesting to see how many more people actually sign up for that. And one of the things, this is not necessarily breaking news, but one of the things I'm trying to do now, using Kemi Jonah's approach at UVA, is how can we move away from just talking about degrees versus credentials, because it's everything, but how can we make the combo platter, right, which was mentioned by, again, Rick and Jeff. I feel like, Jeff and Roy, I feel like we can just have a conference just based on YouTube, just talking about all your observations. But maybe the combo platter is not the degree and the cert. Maybe it's also work-based learning, right? Mm-hmm. So how can we actually add that as a pickle or a slice of cheese on the sandwich that we are building, right? And then collect data on that. So over time, longitudinally, does that make the impact that we're looking for? Because I feel like whether you're from the Lumina camp, or you're from Strata, or you're from Axiom Collaborative, or if you're from Ascendium, we've been kind of dibbling and dabbling in a panacea approach, right? It's got to be, okay, let's look at microcredentials only, or let's look at work-based learning only, and it's a combination of those things. And so that's where we're headed, I think, with NASH, to kind of take a look at that. But it still kind of comes down to us moving away from this false choice, right? It's not a degree versus the cert versus anything. It's really a cumulative experience that we want to build for learners. And it's not always going to be about rock walls, right, which campuses are notorious, or floating, floating?
Lazy river.
Yeah, lazy rivers, right? It's not about those things. It's about everything else that we can provide.
So we can take a few questions from the audience. I already see a hand raised. Michelle, did you want to run the mic over there?
Hi there, Jennifer Fong from IEEE. I just actually wanted to kind of expand on what you were just saying, because it very much aligns with the approach that IEEE is taking as we are looking at workforce, and we're looking primarily in things like advanced manufacturing. There are huge workforce gaps. They are building big fabrication facilities, and they don't have enough technical workers to fill them. And a lot of those technician level jobs do not require 4-year degrees. However, when you open up pathways for people who may not have had access to higher education before, whether that be for financial reasons or whatever, you bring people in and train them with these non-degree credentials so that they can get the interview to get in there and start working. Then they start learning on the job. Then they can go for more education, which ultimately can lead them to then needing a degree in engineering and others. But you're creating brand new pathways for groups that we have not been able to reach before. So, you know, for me, that's very exciting. Thanks.
So, Kelvin or Larry, if you didn't have any reaction to that, we have another question.
Sounds good to me.
Sounds good. Yes, please.
Hi, Talisa Jackson-Wynn with WorkCredit, an affiliate of ANSI. So the question I had is really based around like what we're seeing right now is the fact that AI is accelerating how fast job requirements are changing, right? So like you're seeing where used to be you change every 3 to 5 years, now you're seeing it yearly. And universities, colleges are essentially being asked to respond to that and be more, industry driven and things of that nature, but all this takes time. So even if you say that like, hey, we need to do this for workplace planning, that takes time. You're trying to do it for your degrees, for anything, all of it takes time. So curious on your thoughts around, how should higher education institutions really adapt to that? Or if you're seeing that in like what you're finding and what's working. And, if no one is currently doing it, then like, what would you like to see? Yeah,
that's a great question because I think it's like an exercise that needs to happen regardless of whether philanthropic funding is into the conversation to support it. With that being said, like an interesting example that'll be interesting to follow. It's still at the campus level though, so I would love to see this more at a system level. Is what the Association of Community College Trustees is doing. How many people are familiar with ACCT? They have a partnership, for example, with New America. And they're working with, again, with a small number. I don't know if they've announced it yet, but they're working with a small number of community colleges to do like a self-assessment to actually help them think through at least their approaches to work-based learning, right? So I think a part of it is just like unpacking, at least in terms of work-based learning, one thing you could do is just understanding at the campus level, where are the gaps? Like, if you do want to impact workforce development, what are you doing around credential work? What are you doing around work-based learning? And where are the opportunities? But that, to your point, that does take time, and I think that's why in the previous session, right, we heard that if intermediaries and philanthropy can kind of help bring more people to the table to do that mental exercise of where we can actually better prepare learners in lots of different ways, right? And because a part of it is pedagogically, right? What are the skills and competencies, if we believe what skills are? Like, how can we help schools translate learning objectives to skills and competencies just so that learners can tell a better story about what they know and what they can do? But then also, to what extent can we also help institutions track how learners are actually improving in their perceived and actual career readiness, which definitely requires time and effort.
So one of the things we've seen, which has been interesting, is how different the governance structures are typically for the credit side and the non-credit side. And I think, as you all know, that on the credit-bearing side, things move so slowly. But on the non-credit side, things can move really quickly because there's typically a different governance structure. And so some of the learning that we've seen from institutions is sort of watching the credit-bearing side, see how nimble the non-credit-bearing side can be, and thinking about, is it time to change governance structures on the credit-bearing side?
Talia, one other point I wanted to raise, when you mentioned this idea that there's increasing demand, this kind of half-life. I think we're getting at this idea of a half-life of skills. So it gets talked a lot we hear about it a lot in workforce conferences these days. And I will be honest, I think that there are some fields of study where we do see these really rapid movements and this really rapid churn. I don't know if that's true across the entire occupational landscape. When we look across all of ONET, when we look across all of the workforce, what I see, and I mean, as speaking from a research group that's really been thinking a lot about skills and how we measure skills lately, it's concentrated. The workforce is spiky. So I think you raise a good point, and it's definitely something that we keep thinking about, and we hear some estimates from different groups that could be as little as every 1.5 years, or it's only 18 months, a half-life of skills, but the reality is that it varies quite a lot. Roy, I see you've got your hand up, like you, and sometimes we try to, but it's your day, Roy. Go for it. We have another one floating.
I have a loud mouth, so. Oh, yeah, here we go. I just want to challenge this idea about governance and non-credit and credit. Healthcare professions have work-based learning from day one on the credit side of the house. There is no reason why that healthcare model cannot be integrated in economics, into English majors, into history majors, and this sort of thing. So I think we're not being that creative on the credit side of the house when it can be done, but it's traditionally not been done outside of these like healthcare models.
Yeah. I have a question too. Piggybacking off that, and I think this was mentioned in a previous session too. Where do the employers? What role do they play? Because I feel like we talk about there's accrediting agencies, but we're talking about skills-based hiring, and they have to have a role to play. They're the ones who are hiring. I think that's really important, and I'm not sure if we are talking to them directly in terms of what they think or what we want them to, or what they need to do in terms of, work-based learning and giving credit for that on your side. So I'm just wondering what you think in terms of the role they can play.
Yeah, I think they play an important role. It almost, and again, I'm someone who came up through, at least initially, through the ranks of faculty and realized I was actually not great at teaching, but more as an administrator. And so I've led online learning initiatives for 2-year and 4-year schools. And so this space is something very new to me, but also very interesting because similar to online learning, I believe, there's like an access issue here. Like we've limited the ability of our learners to gain access to this evolving world of work, again, based on current structures, governance, in part, limits us as well. But I think on the employer side, it's interesting to follow companies, for example, like Ripen, virtual internships, Parker Dewey even, where they bring a marketplace of employers to the table and can help institutions not have to reinvent the wheel in terms of those partnerships. Now, with that being said, those platforms can also be used by institutions to actually have, to help bring employers to the table to actually find ways to leverage learners to work on projects that they value. But you have to do it in a way where it's frictionless, not just for the learner to gain access to work-based learning, let's say, but also for the employer as well, because they have to see, something in it. But we also have to be much more proactive, I think, in terms of seeking out their insights versus the advisory groups that we have. Like, how many of you work for campuses where the advisory group for the employers meets maybe once a year, right? Like, someone buys the pizza, right, schedules the room. And with things changing so much faster now, especially with AI being the hot girl or hot guy at school right now, and sucking a lot of the oxygen out of the room, we need to be meeting with our employers much more regularly. Again, easier said than done, but I think that just needs to change. And we also need to realize that we don't have to always do it ourselves. Like, I don't know this ego that higher ed has collectively is like, no, we'll do it, right? Like we don't need a partner. And I think now more than ever, I think we need to leverage intermediaries like some of the companies that I mentioned and others, maybe even alumni, bringing them to the table as well, because they many of them are also employing our students. So how can we bring alumni to the table to also help us think about how we can better engage and be much more aligned in the work that we're doing to help better prepare our learners for the world of work.
Larry, I'll invite you to react to that, especially the point about employer engagement. I mean, we think as an accreditor, maybe the New England Commission doesn't think so much about engaging directly with employers, but does that play into what you're doing and how you're thinking about the future of accreditation? Should there be more of a role for that sort of engagement?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, we accredit dozens and dozens of community colleges. Community colleges never get talked about when people talk about higher education. And they have always been deeply embedded in their community and deeply connected to employers. And I think you're just seeing that model expanding now to the four-year public regionals that are looking sort of more like community colleges. We're now on an experimental basis approving 90 credit baccalaureate degrees. We've authorized, I don't know, maybe 20 or 25 programs out of 4 or 5 institutions. And these are degrees that are sort of specifically designed to lead directly to work. And in those cases, they are also very, very much employer tied. So it's sort of a new model. We'll sort of see where that goes. It's been very controversial. It was the one discussion that sat in front of our commission for probably 3 years because it felt like we were sort of blowing up the baccalaureate degree by saying you could actually earn a baccalaureate degree not more quickly, because a lot of students earn it more quickly, but by taking fewer credits. Although what we've held on to, sort of speaking to this general ed, is that still 1/3 of your credits, even in that 3-year degree, need to be general ed. But again, I think higher ed tends to be seen as one thing, and it's not one thing. And we have a lot of institutions that I think do a terrific job embedding themselves in the community and being very much and being very nimble and being tied to the employers in their region.
You have a final thought?
Yeah, just really quickly again, I think that is true. I think there's still an access issue, right? And so whether it's community college or universities, one of the things that I think Kemi Jonah's work kind of opened my eyes to, like the unlock for me, and some of the work that Strata, the Business Higher Education Forum, has done in terms of surveys around, again, the lack of internships, right? And not to say that internships is the only thing, right? Again, you heard from Jeff and Roy also talk about apprenticeships. Like, I feel like yes, and, right, to Holly's point, like we need to look at work-based learning much more broadly, and also make sure that that's part of the DNA. Like before, right, it was like, oh, you have to get an internship. Like, why is the burden always back on the student to gain access to these things? And so for us, I think we really need to have a hard conversation about how can we build that into the curriculum, whether it's 90 degrees, 90 credits versus 120, or even
90 degrees outside.
Right. Or 120 credits or competency based, right? Like, again, I felt, I kind of felt like when the 90 credit thing came out, I was like, ugh, like why not CBE, right? Like, why can't we just do that? And then it takes what it takes, right?
We do that too.
Yeah, right. You do that too, but again, 90. But we have to, at least around with work-based learning. I think we need to make sure that whether it's an apprenticeship or an internship or project-based learning, we need to make sure that that's guaranteed, like period, right? And again, easier said than done. But I think we have to stop saying to students, it's on you to get, because again, it's again, it's not easy because internships are in short supply. That's why I think, again, looking at providers like the Ripens and the virtual internships and some of the other companies is worth researching.
Yeah. So, I mean, I do recognize we're at time, but Michelle, if there was one like burning question, that's a very back. We'll be really fast.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So sorry. George at Brightbound. I'm just curious. I know you were talking about having mixed emotions towards stacking, and at the same time, we're talking about credentials and degrees as kind of serving as part of the cumulative experience. Yeah. And so is the negative feeling just about like the logistics in a fragmented market, or how are both of you thinking about like where stacking can serve, how that would all work?
Yeah, I'm just concerned about, again, credit for prior learning. Again, we know that that's part of one of our North Stars to make sure that happens. But as we know, there are many students who, again, don't get that one-to-one credit for it to count towards a degree. Maybe it's, again, in an elective bucket if it's considered at all. And then sometimes there's some like weird shit that goes down. Like even when I was like a director of online learning several years ago for community college, sometimes it's not about sometimes it's the modality too. Like some folks will say, oh, we won't give credit because the course was offered online versus face-to-face, even if the school has an agreement with the university. That actually happened because sometimes the credit, the issue of stackability, I think, to make it short, is that credit for prior learning is uneven, right? And so even though we want to have stackability, I don't think it's always something that every institution can make happen. And sometimes it's not about vertical stackability. I believe in horizontal stackability, right? So regardless of whether or not you get credit for it, if it has a positive impact on you and helps you, I think we should focus sometimes a little bit more on that versus thinking that vertical stacking is the only thing we should focus on. That's just my opinion.
So I think that this will conclude our panel. We have a break. We're going to go into a 10-minute break now. We do have still have the posters in the back of the room. Please sign if you have not already done so, and offer some words of encouragement or tribute to Roy and Jeff. Please go ahead. There's lots of pens, lots of space still on the posters. Please do so. And we'll be back here at 10:45.